"You don't belong here." The voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp, cold, echoing across the crowded terminal of JFK Airport. 1 second later, Dominique Reynolds' black leather suitcase was kicked hard, bursting open as documents and electronic devices scattered across the floor.
I demand immediate
The sound
action.
of things hitting the ground was swallowed by a chorus of gasps from paramedic passengers. The chief flight attendant of Summit Airlines stood there beneath the harsh overhead lights, her blonde hair gleaming, her face calm and proud as if she had just done something righteous. She crossed her arms, lips curling into a smug smile. "Maybe next time you'll know your place." Dominique said nothing. She bent down, collecting each paper, each device that had rolled away, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from holding back anger. Around her, the whispers rose like a wave. "Oh my God, who is she? Why would the flight attendant do that? Is someone recording this?" As every phone camera turned toward them amid the chaos, Dominique stood tall. She didn't shout, didn't argue. Only her eyes, dark, deep, and cold, stared straight into Meredith's. A look that could have made anyone flinch if they had known who she really was. But Meredith didn't. All she saw was a woman of color dressed elegantly, but not the right way. And to her, that alone was wrong. The terminal buzzed with the ambient soundtrack of travel announcements echoing through speakers. The hum of moving walkways, the clatter of luggage wheels against tile, the scent of overpriced coffee mingled with perfume and the sterile, recycled air. Morning sunlight streamed through the vast windows, creating a stark contrast between the bright, promising day outside and the ugly scene unfolding within. A child nearby tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why did that lady kick her bag?" The mother pulled him closer, shielding him from the confrontation, unsure how to explain cruelty in terms a child could understand. The digital clock on the departure board showed 9:32 a.m. In exactly 3 minutes, everything would change. Dominique felt the smooth leather of her watch against her wrist as she gathered a spreadsheet that had slid beneath a nearby chair. The timepiece had been a gift from her brother Jackson when Skyline Safety Systems signed its first $1 million contract. To remember the moment. He'd said, "Now." She checked it instinctively. 32 a.m. as another kind of moment unfolded. The terminal floor was cold against her fingertips as she collected her belongings. The contract, worth $500 million, had thankfully remained intact in its leather portfolio. 6 months of negotiations, technological innovations, and careful relationship building, all scattered across the floor because one woman decided she didn't belong. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, a steady, controlled rhythm that belied the anger coursing through her veins. Years of similar encounters had taught her that losing control meant losing power. So she breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, a technique she'd perfected in boardrooms where she was often the only black woman present. "Do you need some help?" A kind voice broke through her concentration. Maria Gonzalez, a Hispanic woman with warm eyes and gentle hands, was already kneeling beside her, gathering papers. "Thank you," Dominique replied, maintaining her composure. Maria's gaze flickered toward Meredith, then back to Dominique. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "I'm a traveling nurse. The assumptions people make." Their hands touched briefly as they both reached for the same document. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. The shared experience of being judged for existing in spaces others felt they shouldn't occupy. Across the terminal, more people were noticing the commotion. Some stopped, openly staring. Others pretended not to see, the way people often do when confronted with uncomfortable truths. A few approached, offering help or simply bearing witness. "Have you ever been judged based solely on your appearance?" Dominique would later ask in interviews. That moment when someone decides everything about you without knowing your name, your story, your worth. Drop your experiences in the comments below. You're not alone. The question would resonate with millions. But for now, in this terminal, Dominique was focused on a more immediate goal: maintaining her dignity in the face of blatant disrespect. Just 15 minutes earlier, Dominique had walked into Gate 27 with the calm poise of someone who had passed through thousands of airport lounges across the world. A gray suit, thin glasses, a small leather bag. Everything about her was understated, elegant, effortless. The terminal was crowded with Monday morning business travelers, men in dark suits with briefcases, women in tailored blazers checking emails on tablets, all moving with the practiced efficiency of frequent flyers. The scent of coffee was strong near the small cafe at the edge of the waiting area. The hum of voices discussing meetings, deals, and connections created a background drone of commerce in motion. Dominique's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached the boarding gate. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, professional but not flashy, expensive but not ostentatious. The gray suit was tailored perfectly to her athletic frame, a result of her morning running routine. Her natural hair was styled in a short, professional cut that framed her face, highlighting her sharp cheekbones and clear, intelligent eyes. No one knew that inside her briefcase lay a contract worth $500 million, a deal that could redefine the entire aviation industry. No one knew that this woman was the CEO of Skyline Safety Systems, the largest flight safety technology partner Summit Airlines had ever signed. They only saw what they wanted to see, a woman who looked ordinary, and that was enough to judge her. As Dominique checked her phone, she scrolled past a text from her brother Jackson, nervous about today. She had replied simply, "Never nervous, just prepared." It was their ritual exchange before big meetings, dating back to their childhood when Jackson would ask the same question before her spelling bees and debate competitions. The morning sun cast long rectangles of light across the terminal floor. Dominique stepped through one, feeling its warmth momentarily before returning to the artificial cool of the air conditioning. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the late nights coding safety protocols in her studio apartment, the endless rejection letters from investors who couldn't see past her gender and race, the first small contract that had given her company legitimacy, and now this deal that would cement Skyline's position as an industry leader. At 32, Dominique had been asked to move to the back of a corporate function despite being the keynote speaker. "I'm sorry, but the VIP section is for speakers and executives," the event coordinator had said, not bothering to check her credentials. "I am the keynote speaker," Dominique had replied. The coordinator's face had registered shock, then embarrassment. "Oh, The description said we were expecting the CEO of Skyline Systems. You are," she had gestured to herself. Dominique Reynolds, founder and CEO. That interaction had been polite compared to others. At a tech conference in Boston, a man had patted her on the shoulder and asked her to fetch him coffee, assuming she was waitstaff rather than a panelist. In a luxury car dealership in Chicago, a salesman had directed her to the economy models, despite her specifically asking about the high-end sports car in the window. Each incident had been a paper cut small, stinging, but rarely leaving a scar visible to others. Over time, though, paper cuts accumulated. They bled, they hurt, and they taught her to be prepared. That was the genesis of Protocol 3. not just a response to discrimination, but a system to document it, address it, and ultimately transform the environments that allowed it to flourish. Dominique approached the Summit Airlines premium check-in counter. The woman behind the desk, mid-50s with graying hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, smiled warmly. "Good morning. How may I help you today?" "Good morning. I'm checking in for Flight 287 to San Francisco. Seat 2A. Dominique replied, sliding her ID and frequent flyer card across the counter. The woman nodded, typing efficiently. "Yes, Ms. Reynolds. I see your reservation. Would you like to check any bags today?" "No, just carry on." "Perfect. Your flight is on time, scheduled to depart at 10:15. Boarding will begin approximately 40 minutes before departure. You have access to our premium lounge if you'd like to wait there." The interaction was professional, respectful, and exactly what Dominique expected. This was how things should be. This was the baseline of dignity that everyone deserved. As she collected her boarding pass and ID, Dominique noticed Meredith Pearson for the first time. The chief flight attendant was standing near the gate entrance, observing the check-in process with narrowed eyes. Something about Dominique had caught her attention, or perhaps it was the fact that Dominique had been treated with respect that bothered her. Their eyes met briefly, and Dominique recognized something in Meredith's gaze, a calculation, an assessment, a judgment being formed without context or information. It was a look she had seen countless times before, and it usually preceded exactly the kind of interaction she had developed Protocol 3 to address. Dominique held the gaze for a moment, then turned away, her mind shifting to the meeting that awaited her in San Francisco. She had more important things to focus on than one flight attendant's silent disapproval. Little did she know that in less than 20 minutes, that silent disapproval would escalate into a public confrontation that would change both of their lives forever. Boarding began. Morning sunlight poured through the terminal glass, reflecting off the silver body of the A321neo. Dominique stepped through the gate carrying her suitcase. She reached for the overhead compartment above seat 2A when Meredith stepped in front of her. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "That compartment is reserved for legitimate first-class passengers." She emphasized the word legitimate. Dominique paused. Her voice was low but clear. "I am a legitimate passenger." Meredith moved closer, her cheap perfume mixing with the recycled air. "Maybe you should store your bag back there where your kind usually sits." The air froze. From the first row, William Foster looked up from his Wall Street Journal. An elderly woman in row 3 covered her mouth in shock. Dominique didn't react. She stared at Meredith for one long second. "I'll keep my bag here, where my ticket entitles me to sit." The cabin's atmosphere shifted instantly. The gentle hum of pre-flight conversation died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence punctuated only by the distant sound of the aircraft's ventilation system. The scent of fresh coffee being prepared in the galley seemed suddenly out of place amid the tension. William Foster had been observing the interaction with growing concern. At 53, the Harvard Business School professor had witnessed countless subtle acts of discrimination throughout his career, though rarely this blatant. His silver hair and tailored navy suit gave him an air of authority that made people listen when he spoke. And right now, he was considering whether to speak up. He hadn't always done so. 20 years earlier, he had remained silent when a black colleague had been repeatedly interrupted and dismissed during faculty meetings. The guilt from that silence had shaped his subsequent career, leading him to research and write extensively about bias in corporate environments. It had also earned him a place on several corporate boards, including Summit Airlines, where he advocated for more inclusive policies. Now, watching Meredith's behavior, He felt the familiar discomfort of witnessing injustice. His hand moved to his phone, activating the recording function discreetly. Sofia Ramirez, a younger flight attendant standing at the galley entrance, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes darted between Dominique and Meredith, clearly torn between professional loyalty and personal ethics. At 30, Sofia had been with Summit Airlines for only 8 months, still navigating the unwritten rules and power dynamics. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform crisp and perfectly pressed, reflecting her desire to do everything right. "Meredith," she said softly. "Her ticket does say 2A. Meredith's head snapped around, her eyes narrowing. "Did I ask for your input?" "Then back to Dominique, ma'am. If you could just cooperate and move your bag, we can avoid any unpleasantness." The cabin was quiet now. Every conversation had stopped. Passengers who were settling in now watched the confrontation with uncomfortable fascination. Some reached for their phones, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Nicole Bennett, a 27-year-old marketing professional with short blonde hair and bright, observant eyes, was already recording the interaction from her seat in row 4. Her social media instincts told her this might be important to document. Summit Airlines flight attendant challenging a black passenger in first class, she typed as a caption, then hit the live stream button on her phone. Richard Kensington removed his reading glasses. His manner suggested years of judicial authority, which was accurate, as he was a recently retired federal judge, at 62, with distinguished gray hair and piercing blue eyes that had evaluated countless testimonies. He watched Meredith's behavior with growing concern. "Young lady," he began, addressing Meredith, "this seems unnecessary." Meredith's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "Sir, I'm just doing my job, ensuring proper cabin management. I've been flying first class for 30 years, Richard replied calmly. "I've never seen proper cabin management require questioning a passenger's right to be here." Meredith's cheeks flushed slightly. Richard Kensington's voice carried the weight of authority, and other passengers were nodding in agreement with his assessment. Dominique placed her bag firmly in the overhead bin. "My bag stays here. My seat is here. That's final." The decisive tone in Dominique's voice caused several passengers to exchange glances. It wasn't the voice of someone intimidated or uncertain. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Meredith's face flushed deeper. She leaned closer, dropping her professional veneer. "We'll see about that." The threat hung in the air as she turned and stalked toward the front galley. Sofia gave Dominique an apologetic look before following her senior colleague. "In the galley." Meredith's whispered words were still audible to the first few rows. "I can't believe they'll let anyone in first class these days if they pay enough. There used to be standards." Sofia's response was too quiet to hear, but her uncomfortable expression spoke volumes. Dominique settled into 2A, removing a slim laptop from her carry-on. She began reviewing documents as if nothing unusual had occurred, but her senses remained heightened, aware that this confrontation wasn't over. Maria Gonzalez, now seated across the aisle, offered Dominique a sympathetic smile. "I'm Maria," she said quietly. That was completely unprofessional of her. "Thank you," Dominique replied. "I'm Dominique. I've seen this before." Maria continued, her voice low. "I'm a traveling nurse. The assumptions people make based on appearance never cease to amaze me. Last month in Dallas, a patient refused to believe I was his nurse, kept asking when the real nurse would arrive." Dominique nodded in understanding. "It's exhausting," Isn't it? The constant need to justify your presence? Exactly. Maria agreed. Like, we need to present credentials just to exist in certain spaces. Their conversation was interrupted by William Foster, who leaned slightly over from his seat in 1B. Excuse me, he said quietly. I want you to know that I've documented that interaction. It was completely inappropriate. Thank you. Dominique replied, studying him with interest. I appreciate that. William Foster. He introduced himself. Harvard Business School. Dominique Reynolds. Skyline Safety Systems. A flash of recognition crossed his face at the company name, but he didn't comment further, simply nodding respectfully before returning to his newspaper. However, his phone remained positioned on his armrest, still recording. Still, as other passengers continued boarding, the tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. Conversations resumed, but in hushed tones, many discussing what they had just witnessed. Did you see how that flight attendant spoke to her completely uncalled for? I've never seen anything so blatant. Dominique heard the comments but kept her focus on her work. Years of experience had taught her that maintaining professionalism in the face of discrimination was often the most powerful response. She would not give Meredith the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. However, when she realized she'd left an important business card in the terminal, she decided to retrieve it quickly before departure. As she rose from her seat, she noticed Meredith watching her from the galley, a calculating look in her eyes. I'll be right back. Dominique mentioned to Maria, I need to grab something from the terminal. Of course, Maria replied. I'll watch your things. As Dominique walked up the aisle and out of the aircraft, she didn't see Meredith follow her after a brief delay. She didn't notice the determined set of Meredith's shoulders or the slight smile that played at the corners of her mouth as she followed Dominique into the terminal. What happened next would be captured by dozens of phones, documented in detail by Protocol 3, and would ultimately change both women's lives forever. Now we return to the opening scene, but with more context and detail. The overhead terminal clock showed 9:32 a.m. when Meredith followed Dominique back into the terminal area after Dominique left to retrieve her dropped business card. You don't belong here. The words hung in the air for a moment before Meredith's foot connected with Dominique's suitcase, sending it skidding across the polished floor. The lock burst open, and papers, including the $500 million contract, scattered everywhere. The sound echoed across the terminal, the thud of the kick, the scrape of the suitcase against tile, the crack of the lock breaking, and the flutter of documents spreading like leaves in an autumn wind. Nearby, conversations halted mid-sentence. The coffee cup in a businessman's hand paused halfway to his lips. A child pointed, only to have his hand gently lowered by his mother. The terminal clock now showed 9:33 a.m. Exactly 2 minutes until everything would change. As Dominique knelt to gather her belongings, memories flashed through her mind in vivid detail. At 24, fresh out of MIT with a master's in aerospace engineering and a vision for revolutionizing flight safety. She had arrived at a boutique hotel in Atlanta after a red-eye flight. Her meeting with potential investors was in 3 hours, and she desperately needed to shower and change. She was dressed in sweats, exhausted from the flight, her hair wrapped in a satin scarf, with a confirmed reservation made weeks in advance. The man at the desk had looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her casual clothes and scarf-covered hair. His lip had curled slightly as he'd said, "You don't look like someone who'd stay here." He claimed the system was down and suggested she come back when the manager was around. No rooms were available now, he insisted. Despite her confirmation email, too tired to argue and needing to prepare for her meeting, she had returned to her rental car, changed clothes in a gas station bathroom, and presented herself for her meeting without sleep. The investors had passed on her proposal. That night, sleeping in her car in the hotel parking lot, she had opened her laptop and begun outlining a business plan that would grow into Skyline Safety Systems. If they won't let me in, she'd thought, I'll build something they can't keep out. At 32, now the CEO of a growing tech company, she had been asked to move to the back of a corporate function, despite being the keynote speaker. The event coordinator had looked right through her, assuming she was support staff rather than the main attraction. At 38, she had signed her first $100 million contract while the client repeatedly addressed her male assistant instead of her. It had taken Jackson clearing his throat and saying, "Miss Reynolds is the one you should be talking to. I just take notes," for the client to finally make eye contact with her. Each memory fueled her composure rather than breaking it. Each insult had taught her that losing control meant losing power. Each slight had strengthened her determination to create change that went beyond her own experience. Now, at 42, as she gathered her scattered documents from the floor of JFK, she wasn't just collecting papers. She was collecting evidence. The slight tremble in her fingers wasn't from humiliation, but from the effort of containing her righteous anger, not to suppress it, but to channel it constructively. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her throat tightened. A bead of sweat traced a path down her spine despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. But her face remained a mask of dignity, not emotionless, but controlled, deliberate, strategic. Nicole Bennett was live streaming everything. Her phone captured the scattered papers, Dominique's calm determination, and Meredith's smug satisfaction. The number of viewers climbed rapidly, 50, 200, 750, 500. I can't believe what I'm seeing, Nicole narrated quietly. A summit. Airline's flight attendant just kicked this woman's suitcase across the floor. Everything scattered everywhere. Comments began flooding in. What the actual $? Is that legal? Isn't that assault or destruction of property? What airline is this never flying with them, that poor woman? I'd be screaming. William Foster had stepped forward, his phone also recording. His normally composed academic demeanor had given way to visible outrage. "This is absolutely unacceptable behavior from an airline employee," he said loudly, ensuring his voice would be captured by his recording. "I am a board member of Summit Airlines, and I can assure you, this violates multiple company policies." Meredith's expression flickered briefly at this revelation, but she quickly recovered, doubling down rather than backing off. "Board members don't typically interfere with cabin crew duties," she replied coolly. "Perhaps you should focus on your responsibilities while I focus on mine." Maria Gonzalez had followed Dominique off the plane and now knelt to help collect the scattered papers, handling each document with care. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you," she whispered, her nursing instincts kicking in as she assessed Dominique for signs of distress. "Is there anything specific I should be careful with?" "The leather portfolio contains a contract," Dominique replied quietly. "Thank you." Richard Kensington had also deplaned to witness the commotion. His judicial mind was already analyzing the situation, categorizing potential infractions. He took out a small leather-bound notebook and began making notes with a fountain pen, his expression grave. "Young lady," he addressed Meredith, "are you aware that your actions could constitute assault and destruction of property under New York law, not to mention violation of several FAA regulations regarding crew conduct?" Meredith stood over them all, her authority seemingly unchallenged in her mind. The Summit Airlines uniform had become her armor, her position a weapon she wielded without hesitation. If you can't keep track of your belongings, perhaps you shouldn't be traveling in premium cabins, she said, looking down at Dominique. First class requires a certain level of competence. The terminal clock now showed 9:34 a.m., 1 minute left. The crowd around them had grown. Passengers waiting at nearby gates had wandered over, drawn by the commotion. Airport staff hovered uncertainly at the edges, unsure how to intervene in a situation involving an airline employee. The circle of phone cameras had expanded, capturing the scene from multiple angles. This is going to be the most documented case of discrimination in aviation history, someone whispered, not realizing how prophetic those words would prove to be. Dominique stood, her documents now gathered, her expression calm despite the storm inside her. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Jackson," she said quietly to her brother. "It's happening. Activate Protocol 3. Jackson Reynolds, seated in his office overlooking Manhattan, immediately understood. As Chief Operations Officer of Skyline Safety Systems, he had helped design Protocol 3 alongside his sister. He had also witnessed the toll that repeated discrimination had taken on her over the years, the nights she returned home exhausted not from work but from the constant battle to be respected. The time she questioned whether the fight was worth it. The rare moments when her carefully constructed composure cracked in private. "Location," he asked, already typing commands into his secure terminal. "JFK Terminal 4, Gate 27. Summit Airlines Flight 287 to San Francisco. Identity of primary aggressor, Meredith Pearson. Chief Flight Attendant, Summit Airlines. Blonde, approximately 38 years old. 5'7". Nature of incident: verbal harassment followed by physical assault on my property. Kicked my suitcase, breaking the lock and scattering contents. Multiple witnesses. Multiple recordings in progress." Jackson's fingers flew across his keyboard. Protocol 3 activated. Documentation systems engaged. Legal team alerted. Real-time analysis initiated. Timeline tracking commenced. "Thank you," Dominique replied, her voice steady. "Are you okay?" Jackson's professional tone softened momentarily. Big brother concern breaking through. "I'm fine," she assured him. "This is what we prepared for." As she ended the call, Dominique noticed Alejandro Morales, a gate agent, watching with growing concern. He had seen Meredith's behavior before but had always felt powerless to address it. Today, something in him shifted as he witnessed Dominique's dignified response to blatant disrespect. He approached cautiously. "Ma'am, is there anything I can do to help?" Meredith immediately tried to take control. "Alejandro, this passenger was causing a disruption. I was attempting to resolve the situation." "That's not what happened," Maria countered firmly, rising to her feet with several of Dominique's recovered documents. "She kicked this woman's suitcase deliberately. We all saw it." Alejandro looked between them, then made his decision. "Ms. Pearson, I need to report this incident to operations." "You do that," Meredith replied with a dismissive wave. "They'll understand I was following protocol." Sofia Ramirez had also emerged from the aircraft, having followed the commotion. She approached cautiously, her face reflecting her internal conflict. "Meredith, I think we should get back to the aircraft." Meredith snapped. "I'll handle this." Sofia hesitated, then straightened her posture. "No, I don't think I will. What you did was wrong." A murmur of approval ran through the gathered crowd. Meredith's face darkened as she realized her authority was eroding in real time. William Foster stepped between Meredith and Dominique. Ma'am, as a frequent flyer with Summit Airlines and a board member, I'm appalled at your treatment of this passenger. Meredith's confidence wavered slightly. Sir, you don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly, he replied. I've seen enough. Richard Kensington joined him, as have I, and I've documented everything. The terminal clock showed 9:35 a.m. The 3-minute mark had arrived. More passengers had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Phones recorded from every angle. The incident had become impossible to ignore or dismiss. What do you think will happen next? Nicole Bennett asked her live stream audience, which had now grown to over 10,000 viewers. Should Summit Airlines fire this flight attendant? Comment below with your thoughts. Comments flooded in. Fire her immediately. I'm never flying Summit again if they keep her. Someone tag the CEO of Summit. That black lady is handling this with such grace. Dominique straightened her jacket and looked directly at Meredith. In exactly 1 minute, you will regret this decision more than any other in your professional career. Meredith scoffed. Is that a threat? No, Dominique replied calmly. It's a forecast. The words sent a ripple through the crowd. There was something in Dominique's tone, a certainty, a knowledge that transcended the immediate confrontation. Several people exchanged glances, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Have you ever watched someone destroy their career in real time? A man whispered to his companion. Because I think that's what's happening right now. As the final seconds ticked down, Dominique stood perfectly still, her gaze never leaving Meredith's face. She had spent years preparing for this moment, not this specific confrontation, but the opportunity to transform an act of discrimination from an isolated humiliation into a catalyst for structural change. Protocol 3 wasn't just about documenting incidents. It was about creating the conditions for accountability that could ultimately lead to transformation, and in less than a minute, those conditions would align perfectly. As the confrontation reached its peak, the small crowd around them had grown larger. Phones recorded from every angle. Nicole Bennett's live stream had already attracted thousands of viewers. It's going viral, someone whispered. The air in the terminal seemed to thicken, charged with tension and anticipation. The normal sounds of the airport announcements, rolling luggage, conversations faded to background noise as everyone focused on the unfolding drama. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast unflattering shadows across Meredith's increasingly defensive face while illuminating Dominique's composed features with an almost ethereal quality. Alejandro moved closer, his Summit Airlines badge displayed prominently. His usually slicked-back hair had a strand falling across his forehead, betraying his agitation. At 36, he had worked for Summit Airlines for nearly a decade, always following protocol, always avoiding conflict. Today would be different. Is there a problem here? He asked, directing his question at Dominique rather than Meredith, a small but significant act of respect. Meredith immediately tried to take control, stepping forward with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. This passenger was causing a disruption. I was attempting to resolve the situation. By kicking her suitcase, someone from the crowd called out. Meredith's head snapped toward the voice, but it was impossible to identify the speaker among the growing audience. Maria Gonzalez stood up, her scrubs visible under her light jacket, giving her an air of medical authority. That's not what happened. She kicked this woman's suitcase deliberately. Her accent became slightly more pronounced as her indignation grew. I have been traveling for 15 years and never seen an airline employee behave this way. Richard Kensington stepped forward, his judicial presence commanding attention. At 6'2", with silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit, he carried the gravitas of someone accustomed to making life-altering decisions. Young lady, I've observed this entire incident. Your behavior is not only unprofessional, but potentially actionable. He handed a business card to Dominique. Richard Kensington, retired federal judge, Eastern District. If you need a statement, my contact information is there. Thank you. Your Honor. Dominique replied with a slight nod. Meredith's face flushed deeper. Her breathing quickened, visible in the rapid rise and fall of her chest. You don't understand our protocols. I understand basic human decency. Richard interrupted, his tone the same one he had used to silence overreaching attorneys in his courtroom. And I understand the law regarding assault and destruction of property. A child nearby pointed at Meredith and whispered loudly to his mother. Is that lady in trouble? The innocent question caused several onlookers to smile grimly. The terminal clock hit 9:36 a.m., the 3-minute mark. Dominique's phone rang. The ringtone box cello suite number 1 cut through the tension. She answered it on speaker, her voice clear and steady. This is Dominique Reynolds, a male voice replied. Ms. Reynolds, this is Thomas Whitfield, CEO of Summit Airlines. I've just been briefed on the situation. Please accept my deepest apologies for what you're experiencing. The crowd went silent. Meredith's face drained of color so rapidly that she seemed to age years in seconds. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Mr. Whitfield, Dominique replied, maintaining eye contact with Meredith. I appreciate your call. However, this situation requires more than an apology. I understand. Thomas's voice came through clearly, as if he were standing right there. I'm on my way to the terminal now. In the meantime, I've authorized immediate action. Meredith finally found her voice, stepping toward the phone. Mr. Whitfield, sir, there's been a misunderstanding. I was following Ms. Pearson. Thomas interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. As CEO of Summit Airlines, I'm informing you that your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Airport security will escort you from the premises and collect your company credentials. The words fell like a gavel. Several people gasped. Nicole Bennett's live stream comment section exploded. OMG, did that just happen 3 minutes from incident to fired? The CEO himself called. This is insane justice in real time. Meredith staggered backward as if physically struck. You can't, she began. I can and I have, Thomas interrupted. Ms. Reynolds, I'll be there in 15 minutes. Please accept my personal apology and know that this behavior in no way represents the values of Summit Airlines. The call ended. The terminal was absolutely silent. Dominique looked at Meredith, who now seemed smaller somehow, diminished. 3 minutes, she said quietly. That's how long it took for justice to arrive. Not because I'm special, but because what you did was wrong. Her words carried in the silence, reaching everyone gathered around them. It wasn't spoken with malice or triumph, but with the simple clarity of truth. Security personnel approached, having been summoned by Alejandro. Ms. Pearson, one officer said, "We need you to come with us." Meredith looked around desperately, seeking support or sympathy, but found none. The crowd that had gathered to witness her assertion of authority now watched her downfall with the same fascination. Her uniform, once a source of power, now seemed to hang on her frame awkwardly, as if it already recognized it no longer belonged to her. "This isn't fair," she whispered, but her protest lacked conviction. As security led her away, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally fear, the crowd began to disperse. The drama had reached its conclusion, or at least this act of it. Conversations resumed, though nearly all focused on what they had just witnessed. "Did you see her face when the CEO called?" I've never seen anyone fired so quickly in my life. That woman must be someone important. Doesn't matter who she is. No one deserves to be treated that way. William Foster approached Dominique. His normally reserved academic demeanor had given way to frank admiration. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "William Foster, Harvard Business School. I'm also on the board of Summit Airlines. I want you to know that I witnessed everything and will ensure this incident receives full attention at our next meeting." Dominique shook his hand. "Thank you, Professor Foster. I appreciate your integrity. I should have spoken up sooner," he admitted, "but I wanted to document the interaction first." "Documentation is crucial," Dominique agreed. "It transforms isolated incidents into evidence of patterns." Richard Kensington introduced himself more formally. "Ms. Reynolds, I've documented the entire incident if you need a statement." "That's very kind of you, Your Honor," Dominique replied. "If you could send your observations to the email address on my card, it would be greatly appreciated." She handed him her business card. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read Dominique Reynolds, CEO, Skyline Safety Systems. "Ah," he said with newfound understanding. "That explains a few things." Nicole Bennett approached cautiously, lowering her phone. Her blonde pixie cut framed a face flushed with excitement and adrenaline. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm Nicole. I captured everything on livestream. It already has over 20,000 viewers. Would you like me to send you the file?" "Yes, please," Dominique said, "and thank you for documenting this." Nicole's eyes widened as she took the offered business card. Wow. I use your company's travel safety app. It's brilliant." "I'm glad you find it useful," Dominique replied with a genuine smile. As the group talked, Sofia Ramirez approached nervously. Her hands twisted the end of her uniform scarf, and her eyes darted occasionally toward the direction Meredith had been escorted. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm so sorry about what happened. I should have spoken up sooner." Dominique turned to her with a gentle smile. "You did speak up, and that matters. What's your name, Sofia Ramirez? I'm a flight attendant with Summit." "Well, Sofia, your courage is noted. Sometimes speaking up, even softly, is the hardest thing to do." Sofia nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "Thank you. It's just... Meredith has been with the airline for so long. She has had so much influence over scheduling and promotions, and that made speaking up even more courageous." Dominique observed, "You chose integrity over convenience." Alejandro joined them, apologizing profusely for not intervening earlier. His accent thickened with emotion as he explained, "I have seen her do this before, but more subtle. Little comments. Extra scrutiny for certain passengers. I should have reported it. Systems often discourage reporting," Dominique said. "They prioritize harmony over accountability. But that's changing." As the impromptu gathering continued, Maria noticed Dominique's suitcase. "Your bag is damaged," she said, pointing to the broken lock and scratched leather. Dominique looked at the scuffed leather. "The broken lock." "Yes, it is. But some damage leads to necessary change." The terminal speakers crackled with the boarding announcement for Flight 287. Passengers looked uncertainly toward the gate. "What about the flight?" Sophia asked. "I'm supposed to be working it, but we're now short a chief flight attendant." "Who's the next senior crew member?" Dominique asked. "That would be Jeffrey. But he called in sick today. It's just me and 2 junior attendants." Dominique checked her watch. "Let's get everyone boarded. I believe Mr. Whitfield will have a solution by the time we're ready to depart." The group moved back toward the gate, where confused passengers were milling about, uncertain whether to board. Sophia stepped up to the microphone, her voice steadier than she felt. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We will begin boarding Flight 287 to San Francisco momentarily. Thank you for your patience." As they walked, Dominique felt her phone vibrate with a text from her brother Jackson. Protocol 3 successfully implemented. Every second documented from 17 different angles. Facial recognition confirmed Meredith Pearson's identity. Voice analysis verified discriminatory intent. Legal team has preliminary report ready. "How are you holding up?" She replied simply. "Standing tall. Always." Jackson's response came seconds later. "Never doubted it. See you in San Francisco. We've got a lot to talk about." Indeed they did. Because while the confrontation had been painful, it had also validated years of work on Protocol 3. What had begun as a way to document discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive system for creating accountability, and today, it had worked exactly as designed. As Dominique approached the gate, she took a deep breath. The $500 million contract in her repaired briefcase was still important. The meeting in San Francisco still mattered. But something else had happened today. Something potentially more significant than any single business deal. A moment of individual accountability had created an opening for structural change, and Dominique Reynolds was ready to walk through that opening, carrying with her the experiences of countless others who had faced similar treatment without the platform or power to address it. "Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you could do something about it?" she would later ask in interviews. Share your story below. Because the first step toward change is breaking the silence. For now, though, she had a flight to catch and a CEO to meet. The journey that had begun with a kicked suitcase was far from over. At 14, Dominique Reynolds had discovered her passion for aviation during a school trip to an aerospace museum, while other students had been bored by the technical exhibits. She had been fascinated. She'd spent hours studying the safety mechanisms of commercial aircraft, asking questions that surprised even the tour guides. The museum had been in Chicago, a 2-hour bus ride from the South Side neighborhood where she and Jackson grew up. Their mother, Eleanor Reynolds, a high school mathematics teacher, had insisted on taking them to museums, libraries, and cultural institutions across the city, determined that her children would have horizons that extended beyond their immediate surroundings. "Knowledge doesn't care where you come from," Eleanor would say. "It only cares where you're going." Their father, Marcus Reynolds, had been an electrical engineer who'd never reached his full potential due to limited opportunities for black professionals in his generation. He'd worked maintenance at O'Hare International Airport, often bringing home stories of the aircraft he helped keep running. His hands, always slightly rough from work, would trace the shapes of wings and fuselages in the air as he described the elegant mechanics of flight. "Nothing man-made has more backup systems than an airplane," he'd explained to a young Dominique one night while helping with her science homework. "Every critical system has redundancies, because failure isn't an option when you're 30,000 feet up." That philosophy that failure shouldn't be an option, that systems should be designed with multiple layers of protection, had shaped Dominique's approach to both engineering and life. When Marcus died unexpectedly of a heart attack when Dominique was 16 and Jackson 18, the siblings had made a pact to fulfill the dreams their father never could. Jackson would handle the business side, Dominique the technical innovation. Together, they would build something that would make their father proud. That fascination never left her. At MIT, she majored in aerospace engineering, often the only black woman in her classes. Her professors recognized her brilliance, but many of her classmates assumed she was there to fill a quota. She graduated top of her class, her thesis on predictive failure analysis in aircraft control systems earning special recognition. The day of her graduation, Eleanor had presented her with Marcus's old toolkit. "Your father always said these tools helped him fix planes. Now it's your turn to use your tools to make sure they never need fixing." That toolkit now sat in a glass display case in her office at Skyline, a reminder of where she had come from and why her work mattered. Her early career had been marked by a series of firsts. First black woman engineer at her firm. First to lead a safety protocol overhaul that reduced incidents by 63%. First to challenge the industry's approach to redundant systems. But with each first came resistance. Men talked over her in meetings. Ideas she proposed would be dismissed, then praised when repeated by white colleagues. Hotel staff would ask if she was in the right place when she arrived for industry conferences. During one particularly frustrating product development meeting at Aerotech Industries, where she worked after graduate school, Dominique had proposed a new approach to black box technology that would transmit critical data in real time rather than storing it for post-crash analysis. "That's completely unrealistic," her department head had said dismissively. "The bandwidth requirements alone make it impractical." 3 months later, the same department head had presented virtually identical technology as his own breakthrough idea. When Dominique had pointed out the similarity to her proposal, he'd replied, "Your concept was vague. I developed actual specifications. It was Jackson who had convinced her to leave. They'll never see your value," he'd said during a late-night phone call. "You need to build something where your ideas can't be stolen or dismissed." After one particularly frustrating experience where an airline had lost critical safety data during a routine test, Dominique had decided to create her own company. Skyline Safety Systems was born in her apartment with nothing but a laptop and a determination to change how the aviation industry approached safety. The early days had been lean. Investors were skeptical of both her youth and her gender. One venture capitalist had asked if her husband or father would be involved in the business. Another had suggested she find a gray-haired man to serve as the public face of the company. Instead, she'd found alternative funding through a grant program for women in STEM and a small business innovation research grant from the Federal Aviation Administration. The first prototype of what would eventually become Skyline's flagship safety monitoring system had been built on her kitchen table, with parts ordered online and assembled by hand. Their first client had been a small regional airline with aging equipment and a new safety-focused CEO. The success of that initial installation had led to word-of-mouth recommendations, and slowly, Skyline had begun to grow. 10 years later, Skyline had become the leading safety technology provider for airlines worldwide. Their systems were in 86% of commercial aircraft globally. The $500 million contract in Dominique's scattered briefcase represented 5 years of work, a revolutionary new safety protocol that Summit Airlines would be the first to implement. But alongside developing aviation safety technology, Dominique had been working on another project, one born of personal experience rather than professional expertise. Protocol 3 had originated after a particularly humiliating experience at an industry conference in Dallas. Dominique, by then the CEO of a successful mid-sized company, had been denied entry to a VIP reception despite having an invitation. The security guard had insisted she must be in the wrong place, even after she'd shown her credentials. "Look," he'd said, speaking slowly as if to a child. "This event is for executives and CEOs, not support staff." Even after she'd explained who she was, he'd remained skeptical until a white male colleague had vouched for her. The experience had left her seething not just with anger, but with frustration at the lack of accountability. There should be a way to document these incidents, she'd told Jackson afterward, not just for personal vindication, but to show the patterns, to make them impossible to dismiss as isolated events. That conversation had planted the seed for Protocol 3. Over the next 2 years, Dominique and Jackson had assembled a team of legal experts, UX designers, AI specialists, and behavioral scientists to create a comprehensive system for documenting, analyzing, and addressing discriminatory incidents. The system operated on 3 levels simultaneously: documentation, which captured every angle of an incident with timestamps and contextual metadata; analysis, which identified patterns and established connections to previous incidents; and action, which generated appropriate responses ranging from immediate interventions to long-term structural changes. What made Protocol 3 revolutionary wasn't just its thoroughness, but its adaptability. Unlike traditional reporting systems that required victims to navigate complicated processes, Protocol 3 was designed to minimize the burden on those experiencing discrimination while maximizing accountability for those perpetrating or enabling it. The name Protocol 3 had come from aviation safety principles. Protocol 1 was prevention, creating environments where discrimination was less likely to occur. Protocol 2 was intervention, training people to recognize and address bias in the moment. Protocol 3 was response, a system for dealing with incidents after they occurred, ensuring accountability and creating pressure for structural change. Most companies focused on the first 2 protocols, investing in diversity training and anti-bias education. But those approaches often failed to create lasting change because they lacked accountability mechanisms. Protocol 3 was designed to fill that gap. Jackson Reynolds, her brother and chief operations officer at Skyline, had warned her about going to the meeting alone. "You know how they are," he'd said during their pre-trip briefing in his spacious office overlooking Central Park. "They see a black woman in casual clothes, and all they see is someone who doesn't belong." Dominique had smiled, a knowing expression that held years of shared understanding. "That's exactly why I need to go alone." Jackson had leaned back in his chair, studying his sister. At 45, he was 3 years her senior, with the same sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes, though his were framed by designer glasses that had become something of a trademark. While Dominique had pursued engineering, Jackson had earned an MBA from Wharton, bringing business acumen to complement her technical genius. "You're hoping someone tests Protocol 3, he'd realized aloud. "You want to create a documented case study." "I'm not hoping for discrimination," she'd corrected. "I'm prepared for it. There's a difference. And if nothing happens, if everyone treats you with the respect you deserve." Dominique had laughed softly. "Then I'll have a pleasant trip and sign a lucrative contract. Either way, Skyline wins." That preparation had proven prescient. As she knelt on the terminal floor, gathering her scattered documents, Protocol 3 was already in motion, documenting everything from multiple angles, creating a record that would be impossible to dismiss or deny, because for years, she had been developing more than safety systems for aircraft. She'd been developing a system to expose the biases that had tried to ground her own career. And today, that system would face its most public test. Meredith Pearson had joined Summit Airlines directly after college. For her, the airline represented everything she aspired to: glamour, prestige, and a world beyond the small Midwestern town where she'd grown up poor and overlooked. Born in Wheeling, West Virginia, to a single mother who worked double shifts at a diner, Meredith had watched travel shows with an almost religious devotion as a child. While other girls had posters of boy bands on their walls, Meredith had collected magazine cutouts of exotic destinations: Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, places that seemed as distant as other planets from the confines of their 2-bedroom apartment. The flight attendants on those shows, with their immaculate uniforms and confident smiles, had represented a kind of feminine power that Meredith coveted. They traveled the world, spoke multiple languages, and commanded respect simply by walking through an airport in their crisp uniforms. You're setting your sights too high. Her mother had warned when 16-year-old Meredith announced her career ambition. People like us don't get jobs like that. That comment, people like us, had lit a fire in Meredith that still burned. She'd worked after school to pay for community college, then transferred to a 4-year university on scholarship. She'd practiced her diction, carefully eliminating any trace of Appalachian accent. She'd studied French and Spanish, cultivated a sophisticated appearance, and applied to every major airline's flight attendant program. Summit Airlines had been the only one to offer her a position. She'd cried when the acceptance letter arrived, seeing it as vindication, proof that she could transcend her beginnings. The pristine uniform, the respect it commanded, the association with luxury. These weren't just job perks to Meredith. They were validation, proof that she had escaped her beginnings. Her obsession with maintaining what she considered standards wasn't just professional pride. It was fear. Fear that if the barriers between first class and everyone else eroded, so would the distinction that gave her life meaning. In Meredith's mind, first class was sacred, a space reserved for a certain type of person. When she'd first started flying, those people had been almost exclusively white, predominantly male, expensively dressed. They'd spoken with the easy confidence of those who never questioned their right to occupy any space. Over the years, that homogeneity had begun to change. First class now included more women, more people of color, more diversity in general. Logically, Meredith knew this was positive progress. Emotionally, it threatened the clear boundaries she'd constructed between her past and present selves. 6 months ago, Summit Airlines had begun implementing new diversity and inclusion protocols. Meredith had sat through the training sessions with growing resentment. To her, they represented a threat to the very hierarchies that made her feel secure. This is how it starts. She'd complained to fellow flight attendant Jeffrey Banks over drinks at an airport bar in Denver. First, they say everyone deserves respect. Next, they're letting anyone into first class. And then, what's the point of having standards at all? Jeffrey had nodded sympathetically, his salt and pepper hair catching the bar's dim light. After 20 years with Summit, he shared some of Meredith's concerns about changing standards, though he was less vocal about them. Corporate keeps pushing these policies from their fancy offices, he'd replied. But we're the ones who have to deal with reality. They don't see what we see every day. What they saw, or what Meredith believed she saw, was a decline in the exclusivity that had made her job special. In her mind, broader access to premium cabins meant a devaluation of her position, a blurring of the lines she'd worked so hard to cross. That morning, waking up for her JFK rotation, Meredith had received a performance review notification. Customer satisfaction scores for her flights were down 12%. The feedback cited perceived unfriendliness and selective service quality. There was a note about scheduling a meeting with Victoria Palmer from HR. The notification had left her stomach churning with anxiety. At 38, with a decade at Summit, Meredith had few marketable skills outside the airline industry. Her identity was inextricably linked to her position. The thought of losing it was terrifying. She'd arrived at the airport tense, defensive, and looking for control. The crisp lines of her uniform and perfectly applied makeup had felt like armor against the uncertainty of her professional future. When she'd spotted Dominique, successful, confident, and black, entering the first-class line, something in her had snapped. Here was a target for all her frustrations. Here was someone she could put in their place to reassert her own. She'd watched the interaction between Dominique and the check-in agent with growing irritation. The easy respect, the lack of scrutiny, the automatic assumption of belonging, all things Meredith felt should be earned, not granted. She doesn't look like first class. Meredith had thought, eyeing Dominique's understated attire. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, just a plain suit and practical shoes. It hadn't occurred to her that true power often dressed simply, that those most secure in their status rarely felt the need to advertise it. As Dominique had approached the aircraft, Meredith had positioned herself strategically by the door, a small exercise of power that she'd performed countless times before. The first impression, the initial greeting, these were opportunities to establish hierarchy, to remind passengers who controlled their experience. "Welcome aboard," she had said to the elderly white couple in 1A and 1C, her smile warm and genuine. Then Dominique had appeared, and Meredith's smile had cooled noticeably. "Seat number," she'd asked, despite the boarding pass clearly visible in Dominique's hand. The momentary confrontation over the overhead bin had been instinctive, a small assertion of authority, a reminder that Meredith controlled this space. The comment about "your kind" had slipped out almost unconsciously, a phrase she'd heard in childhood directed at her own family, now repurposed as a weapon. What Meredith didn't know was that 3 complaints about her treatment of minority passengers had already been filed in the past 2 months. What she didn't know was that Thomas Whitfield, CEO of Summit Airlines, had personally flagged her file after a particularly troubling incident involving an elderly Asian couple who'd been denied pre-boarding despite having clear mobility issues. What she didn't know was that she was already on thin ice before Dominique Reynolds had ever entered the terminal. She didn't know that the HR meeting scheduled for Friday wasn't just about performance review, it was a final warning before potential termination. She didn't know that Jeffrey Banks, her trusted colleague, had himself reported her behavior to HR after witnessing a pattern he could no longer ignore. She didn't know that her career at Summit Airlines was hanging by a thread, and that by kicking Dominique's suitcase across the terminal floor, she had just cut that thread herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become the very thing she had once resented. Growing up in West Virginia, she had been judged, dismissed, and excluded based on her accent, her clothes, her zip code. The pain of those experiences hadn't taught her empathy. It had taught her to cling desperately to any status she could acquire and defend it fiercely against perceived outsiders. What would happen in the next 3 minutes would shatter the identity Meredith had spent decades constructing. The uniform that had given her status would be taken away. The authority she'd wielded would evaporate. The distinction between her past and present selves would collapse. And in that collapse, she would be forced to confront truths about herself that she had spent a lifetime avoiding, that her sense of worth had become dependent on devaluing others, that her escape from one kind of discrimination had led her to perpetuate another, and that the standards she'd fought so hard to uphold had been flawed from the beginning. Back on the aircraft, Sofia Ramirez was nervously arranging welcome drinks for first class. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed crystal glasses on a silver tray, causing the ice cubes to clink together musically. The galley's bright fluorescent lighting highlighted the beads of sweat forming on her forehead, despite the cabin's aggressive air conditioning. She kept glancing at the door, wondering what was happening in the terminal. The confrontation she'd witnessed had left her stomach in knots, partly from anxiety about Meredith's behavior, partly from guilt at her own hesitation to intervene more forcefully. The other flight attendants, Jessica Martinez and David Chen, both recent hires with less than 6 months at Summit, had picked up on her tension but didn't understand its source. "Everything okay?" Jessica asked, arranging napkins with the Summit Airlines logo precisely on small porcelain plates. At 24, with a hospitality degree and perfectionist tendencies, Jessica approached each task with meticulous attention to detail. "Fine," Sofia replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. There was an incident with Meredith and a first-class passenger." David glanced up from the catering cart he was organizing. Let me guess, she didn't think they looked right for first class. The accuracy of his assessment surprised Sophia. You've seen her do this before? David nodded, his expression carefully neutral. 3 times during my training flights. Always with passengers of color. Always subtle enough that they can't quite call her on it, but obvious enough that they know what's happening. Why didn't you report it? Sophia asked. David's laugh held no humor. I'm a 23-year-old Asian American rookie. She's a senior flight attendant with a decade of experience. Who do you think the company would believe? The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortably close to the truth. Summit Airlines, like many large corporations, had robust anti-discrimination policies on paper. In practice, reporting mechanism often favored those with seniority and institutional power. Jessica sighed, adding another perfectly folded napkin to her stack. My cousin works for United. She says all the airlines are the same. They talk about diversity and inclusion. But when it comes to actually protecting employees or passengers from discrimination, there's suddenly no clear protocol. The irony of that statement, given Dominique's development of Protocol 3, would only become apparent to them later. William Foster had returned to his seat. 1B. His phone still recording discreetly. The Harvard professor's usually calm demeanor was tense with controlled anger, not just at what he had witnessed, but at his own initial hesitation to intervene more forcefully. He was texting rapidly, his fingers moving with surprising speed for a man in his 50s. On Summit Flight 287. Just witnessed appalling discrimination by Chief FA. Recording everything. This needs board attention. The recipient was Jonathan Harris, Summit Airlines chairman of the board. Foster wasn't just a business school professor. He was a board member of multiple Fortune 500 companies, including Summit Airlines, a fact he hadn't mentioned to Dominique, wanting her to see him as an ally because it was right, not because of his position. Harris's response came quickly. Details Foster typed. Chief FA Meredith Pearson verbally harassed black female passenger in first class, questioned her right to be there, then followed her into terminal and physically kicked her luggage, scattering contents across floor. Multiple witnesses, multiple recordings in progress. The 3 dots indicating Harris was typing appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, Christ. Whitfield needs to know immediately. This could be catastrophic. Already reaching out to him. Foster replied. This passenger isn't just any passenger. She's Dominique Reynolds, CEO of Skyline. The response was instantaneous. The Dominique Reynolds. The $500 million contract Dominique Reynolds. The same. I'm documenting everything. Thank you. Keep me posted. Emergency board call likely. Foster put down his phone and took a deep breath. As a Harvard professor specializing in ethical leadership and corporate governance, he had written extensively about how organizations respond to crisis moments, those inflection points where institutional values are tested in public view. This was precisely such a moment for Summit Airlines. Their response would reveal the truth about their culture far more clearly than any mission statement or diversity initiative ever could. Across the aisle, Richard Kensington was speaking quietly into his phone. Margaret. It's Richard. Cancel my dinner with Judge Williams tonight. I've just witnessed something that requires my attention. His wife of 40 years responded with the calm understanding of someone accustomed to the demands of a judicial career. Another case. Not officially. No, but potentially significant. It appears to be a clear case of discriminatory conduct by an airline employee against a black female passenger. And you're involving yourself because... Richard smiled slightly. Margaret always could see through him, because she handled it with remarkable dignity. And I respect that. Also, someone needs to ensure the facts are documented accurately. After retiring from the federal bench 2 years earlier, Richard had found himself increasingly drawn to civil rights issues. His own record as a judge had been fair, but in retrospect, he felt he hadn't done enough to address structural inequalities in the legal system. This post-retirement phase had become something of a personal redemption tour, a chance to use his expertise and authority in service of justice beyond the constraints of judicial procedure. In row 3, Maria Gonzalez sat with her hands clasped tightly. As a traveling nurse who had worked in 47 states, she had seen how differently patients were treated based on their appearance, accent, or skin color. What she had just witnessed brought back painful memories of her own mother being mistreated by airline staff years ago. Maria's mother, a respected pediatrician in Honduras, had immigrated to the United States when Maria was 12. Despite her medical credentials, she had been consistently underestimated, questioned, and dismissed often by people with far less education and expertise. No matter your achievements, her mother had told her, some people will only ever see your accent and your skin color. Watching Dominique face similar treatment had stirred a familiar anger in Maria. But Dominique's response, controlled, dignified, strategic, had been unlike anything Maria had witnessed before. There had been no desperate pleading, no emotional outburst, no resignation, just a calm certainty that accountability would come. Maria wondered what gave Dominique that confidence. She didn't yet know about Protocol 3 or Skyline safety systems. She didn't know she had just witnessed the deployment of a system designed specifically for this kind of moment. Nicole Bennett was still live streaming from her seat in row 4. Her marketing background gave her a keen understanding of how quickly stories could spread across digital platforms. She kept her voice low, narrating the unfolding events for an increasingly large audience. "I'm on Summit Airlines Flight 287 at JFK," she was saying quietly into her phone. A flight attendant just kicked a black woman's suitcase across the terminal floor. Everything's scattered everywhere. The woman is staying incredibly calm, but everyone around is in shock. Comments were flooding in. "This is outrageous. What airline is this? Never flying with them again? That flight attendant needs to be fired. That poor woman. I'd be screaming. Who is she? She's handling this like a boss. I don't know. Seems like an overreaction to me. We're only seeing part of the story." "Nope. I was there. Saw the whole thing. Flight attendant was 100% in the wrong." Nicole continued. "People are gathering around. Lots of phones recording. There's a distinguished older gentleman who seems to be documenting everything in a notebook. And another man just identified himself as a board member of the airline. The live stream audience had grown to over 5,000 viewers in just minutes, with the numbers climbing rapidly as people shared the link across platforms. The incident was transforming from a private humiliation to a public reckoning in real time. Alejandro Morales had returned to the gate desk, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the phone. His dark eyes darted nervously around the terminal as he waited for someone to answer. "This is Gate 27. I need to speak with operations immediately. We have a situation." The voice on the other end sounded mildly annoyed. "What kind of situation, Chief Flight Attendant Pearson just had a confrontation with a first-class passenger? Physical confrontation? In the terminal. Many witnesses, many recordings." There was a pause. "Then define physical confrontation." She kicked the passenger's suitcase across the floor. Contents everywhere. "Very bad. Jesus Christ." The operations manager muttered. "Stay there. I'm calling this up the chain immediately." The boarding process had stalled completely. Passengers in line were whispering among themselves, many with phones raised, recording everything. The confrontation had become the focal point of the entire gate area. As minutes passed, rumors spread through the cabin. Some passengers were checking Twitter and finding clips of the incident already circulating. "They're saying the passenger is some kind of VIP," one man whispered to his seatmate. "I heard the flight attendant got fired on the spot," replied another. "Good. Did you see what she did?" "Completely unprofessional." "I don't know." A third passenger interjected. "Seems a bit extreme to fire someone on the spot. We're all having bad days sometimes. Bad day doesn't justify kicking someone's luggage." The first passenger countered. "That crosses a line. Still, firing without due process." "That's cancel culture run amok," the third insisted. "Accountability isn't cancellation," a woman 2 rows ahead turned to say. "It's consequences." Sophia struggled to maintain professionalism while dealing with increasingly angry and confused passengers. Without a chief flight attendant, she was technically in charge, but she had no information about what was happening or how to proceed. "Will the flight be canceled?" asked an elderly woman in 3D, her voice quavering with anxiety. "No, ma'am," Sophia assured her, though she had no idea if this was true. "We're just experiencing a slight delay. We should have an update soon." William Foster stood up and approached Sophia, recognizing her distress. "May I have a word?" he asked quietly. Sophia nodded, relieved to speak with someone who seemed to have information. "I'm on the board of Summit Airlines," he told her, showing her his ID. "I've been in contact with Thomas Whitfield. He's on his way here now. In the meantime, he's asked that you continue with pre-departure service as normal. The flight will proceed as scheduled." Sophia's eyes widened. "Mr. Whitfield is coming here personally. What about Miss Pearson?" "Miss Pearson is no longer employed by Summit Airlines," William replied simply. "I believe you're in charge of the cabin now." Sophia swallowed hard. "I've only been flying for 8 months. I'm not qualified to be chief flight attendant." William smiled kindly. "Today, qualification seems to be about character rather than seniority. Mr. Whitfield specifically mentioned your intervention on behalf of Ms. Reynolds." He was impressed. As William returned to his seat, Sophia straightened her uniform and took a deep breath. She picked up the cabin phone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is your flight attendant Sophia speaking. We apologize for the delay. We will be ready for departure shortly. In the meantime, please enjoy our pre-departure beverage service." As she moved through the cabin, Sophia noticed the whispers, the side glances, the phones still recording everything. She felt as if she were performing on stage rather than doing her job. Every interaction seemed charged with significance. When she reached Maria Gonzalez in row 3, Maria touched her arm gently. "You're doing great," she said quietly. "Standing up for what's right isn't easy." Sophia managed a grateful smile. "Thank you. I just hope I didn't ruin my career. Some principles are worth the risk." Maria replied. The tension in the cabin continued to build as passengers wondered what would happen next. Would the mysterious Dominique Reynolds return to take her seat? Would there be further confrontation? The anticipation was palpable, turning what should have been a routine flight into something that felt historic. At Skyline Safety Systems headquarters in downtown Manhattan, Jackson Reynolds was activating Protocol 3. The sleek, modern office overlooking the Hudson River had been designed to reflect the company's commitment to both cutting-edge technology and human-centered design. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with natural light, illuminating the activity now unfolding in the Crisis Response Center. A team of legal experts was already reviewing the live stream footage streaming onto large wall-mounted displays. Documentation specialists were capturing and archiving every second of video from multiple angles. AI analysts were running facial recognition, voice pattern analysis, and behavioral assessments in real time. "Time-stamp everything," Jackson instructed, his voice calm but authoritative as he paced the length of the glass conference table. His tailored navy suit and trademark round glasses gave him the look of a tech executive rather than a traditional aerospace industry leader. "I want facial recognition on every witness, background profiles on all summit staff involved, and a complete transcript within the hour." The Skyline response team had been trained for this. Protocol 3 wasn't just about documenting discrimination. It was about creating an irrefutable record that could drive institutional change. The room hummed with focused energy as specialists typed on keyboards, analyzed data streams, and coordinated response efforts. Unlike the chaotic war rooms often depicted in movies, this operation ran with precision and calm, a reflection of the Reynolds siblings' shared belief that crisis management required clear thinking, not adrenaline-fueled reaction. Naomi Washington, Skyline's chief legal counsel, approached Jackson with a tablet. "We've identified all key witnesses. William Foster is a Summit board member. Richard Kensington is a retired federal judge. Nicole Bennett is a marketing director with over 50,000 social media followers. This couldn't have happened in front of a more influential audience if we'd planned it." "We didn't plan the audience," Jackson reminded her, taking the tablet to review the information. "We just made sure we were prepared for the moment." Naomi nodded, her expression serious. At 45, with 20 years of corporate law experience and a specialization in discrimination cases, she brought both legal expertise and personal conviction to her role. "The documentation is exceptional," she noted. "Multiple angles, clear audio, timestamp verification. There's no ambiguity about what occurred." "And the background check on Meredith Pearson Jackson asked?" "Revealing," Naomi replied, swiping to a new screen. 3 formal complaints in the past 8 weeks, all involving passengers of color in premium cabins, all documented in Summit's system but not addressed, plus 5 informal reports through their customer feedback channels that show a clear pattern. Jackson frowned. "So Summit knew about this behavior and failed to intervene." "It appears so. Their HR had scheduled a meeting with her for Friday, but no disciplinary action had been taken despite the pattern." This information added a new dimension to the situation, one that shifted focus from individual behavior to institutional responsibility. Protocol 3 was designed to address both, creating pressure points for change at multiple levels. Another team member called out from across the room. "The video has reached 300,000 views across platforms. Major news outlets are picking up. CNN just requested permission to use the footage." Jackson nodded. "Granted, with the condition that they credit the original sources and don't edit for content. And make sure our media team is preparing statements. We want to be ready when reporters start calling." The phones were already ringing throughout the office. Journalists, industry analysts, and corporate partners, all seeking comment on the viral confrontation. Jackson had instructed the communications team to acknowledge the incident, but defer detailed statements until Dominique had completed her immediate business at JFK. His phone rang. It was Dominique. "How are we looking?" she asked without preamble. "Better than we could have hoped," Jackson replied, stepping away from the team for privacy. "The documentation is flawless. The audience is influential. The reach is growing exponentially. And most importantly, you executed perfectly." "I didn't do anything special," Dominique said. "Exactly. You were just a black woman trying to board a plane, and that was enough to expose everything." There was a brief silence before Dominique spoke again. "Is the legal team confident about the response options?" "Completely. We have multiple paths forward, all solid. This is as clean a case as we could ask for." "Good. I'll call again after I've spoken with Whitfield. As the call ended, Jackson turned back to the room. The wall displays now showed multiple news channels covering the story, social media metrics tracking engagement, and legal analyses of potential implications. Protocol 3 was functioning exactly as designed, creating a comprehensive, real-time record of both the incident and its ripple effects. Across town, in the Summit Airlines corporate offices, alarms were going off. Literally, their social media monitoring system had detected a sudden spike in mentions, all negative, all centered around a developing situation at JFK. Red indicators flashed on screens throughout the communications department as sentiment analysis showed a rapid decline in brand perception. Victoria Palmer, the HR director, was already in emergency mode, having been alerted to the situation by both operations and the communications team simultaneously. "Get me everything on Meredith Pearson's file," she instructed her assistant as she rushed toward the executive elevator. "And find Thomas Whitfield immediately." At 41, Victoria had spent nearly 2 decades in corporate HR, the last 5 at Summit. She had been pushing for stronger enforcement of anti-discrimination policies for years, often facing resistance from older executives who preferred to handle such matters quietly. Now, as she hurried through the gleaming headquarters with its wall-mounted model aircraft and motivational posters about reaching new heights together, she felt a mix of vindication and dread. This was exactly the kind of incident she had warned about in her last presentation to the executive committee, a public exposure of behaviors that had been allowed to persist despite clear warning signs. Her recommendations for a more rigorous response protocol had been tabled for further review. Now that review would happen under the harsh spotlight of viral scrutiny. Thomas Whitfield was already on the phone with his driver when Victoria reached his office. "Get me to JFK now," he was saying, his normally measured voice tense with urgency. "Use the siren if you have to." At 58, Thomas had been CEO of Summit for just under 2 years. He had come from outside the airline industry, bringing with him a reputation for corporate transformation and a mandate from the board to modernize Summit's culture. His silver hair and tailored suits gave him an air of traditional authority that helped soothe the old guard, while he quietly implemented progressive changes. "Thomas," Victoria said as he ended the call, "I have Meredith's file. There's something you need to see before you go." He gestured for her to continue, already gathering his coat and briefcase. 3 formal complaints in the past 2 months, all documenting similar behavior, plus a pattern of concerning customer feedback going back further. We had scheduled an intervention for Friday. Thomas stopped, his expression darkening. "Why wasn't I informed of these complaints earlier?" Victoria hesitated. "The existing protocol requires HR to attempt resolution before escalating to your level. I was following the procedure established by your predecessor." "That procedure changes today," Thomas said firmly. "From now on, any pattern of discriminatory behavior comes directly to me, regardless of the employee's position or tenure." He checked his watch, a vintage Rolex that had belonged to his father, the first black commercial airline pilot in the Midwest. "I need to go, but we'll revisit this entire system when I return." His second call as he rode the elevator to the waiting car was to William Foster. "Will, I just got your text. Is that really Dominique Reynolds?" "Yes," Foster confirmed, his voice clear despite the background noise of the aircraft cabin. "The woman your chief flight attendant just publicly humiliated is the CEO of Skyline, your $500 million safety partner." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, processing the magnitude of the situation. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Keep recording everything." He ended the call, then immediately dialed Dominique's number, which he had from previous contract negotiations. When she answered, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Reynolds, this is Thomas Whitfield. I've just been briefed on what happened. Please accept my deepest apologies. After ending that call, he sat back in his seat as the car accelerated through Manhattan traffic. This wasn't just a PR crisis or an HR incident. This was a moment that would define his leadership and potentially reshape Summit Airlines' culture for years to come. The question wasn't whether to respond decisively, that was clear, but how to ensure that the response led to lasting change rather than superficial damage control. His phone rang again. It was Harold Jenkins, the veteran COO who had been with Summit for over 20 years. Thomas, I just heard about the incident at JFK. Harold began, his voice tense. The videos are already going viral. We need to get ahead of this. I'm already on my way to the airport, Thomas replied. I've spoken with Ms. Reynolds and terminated the flight attendant. There was a pause on the line. You fired her without an investigation, without due process. That's going to create problems with the union. The evidence is unambiguous. Harold, she kicked a passenger's luggage across a terminal floor. That alone is grounds for immediate termination, regardless of who the passenger was. Still, there are protocols that have clearly failed us. Thomas interrupted. 3 prior complaints about this flight attendant were sitting in HR, unaddressed. The protocols you're defending are part of the problem. Harold's sigh was audible. You're moving too fast. Thomas, this kind of knee-jerk reaction, it's not knee-jerk. It's decisive, and it's necessary. We'll talk more when I get back. But right now, I need to handle this situation. As he ended the call, Thomas knew he had just created another battle for himself. Harold represented the old guard at Summit, executives who preferred gradual change and minimal disruption. They would resist any significant cultural transformation, seeing it as a threat to established power structures. But for Thomas, that resistance was precisely why transformation was necessary. He had seen firsthand how institutions could perpetuate discrimination not through active malice, but through passive inertia, the collective unwillingness to disrupt comfortable patterns even when those patterns caused harm. In the air traffic control tower, a request had just come in to hold Summit Flight 287 at the gate. The controller, a veteran with 25 years of experience, looked confused. Confirm reason for delay. Executive order, came the response. CEO inbound. The controller raised an eyebrow. In all his years managing the complex choreography of one of the world's busiest airports, he had never received this particular reason for a delay. Approved, he replied. Advise when ready for departure clearance. Meanwhile, in the terminal bathroom, Sophia Ramirez was making a difficult decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd been given during orientation, but never thought she'd use. Summit Airlines Ethics Hotline. How may I direct your concern? The voice was professional but warm, designed to put nervous callers at ease. Sophia took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the sink with her free hand. My name is Sophia Ramirez. I'm a flight attendant on Flight 287 at JFK. I need to report a serious incident involving discriminatory behavior by my supervisor, Meredith Pearson. There was a brief pause. Then the operator's voice softened. Ms. Ramirez, we're already aware of the situation. Your willingness to report it speaks to your integrity. Mr. Whitfield has asked that you continue as acting chief flight attendant for this flight. Can you do that? Sophia hadn't expected this response. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed her surprised eyes wide, lips slightly parted. Yes, I can, but I don't have the proper certification. This is a special circumstance. The necessary paperwork has already been filed. Just do your best and know that you have full support from headquarters." As Sophia ended the call, she looked at herself in the mirror. 8 months ago, she'd been a graduate student dreaming of seeing the world. Now she was about to lead a cabin crew on what had become the most high-profile flight in Summit Airlines history. "You can do this," she told her reflection, squaring her shoulders and adjusting her uniform scarf. Then she straightened her posture, fixed her hair, and headed back to the gate. The clock showed 9:42 a.m. 9 minutes since the suitcase had been kicked. 3 minutes since Meredith Pearson had been fired on the spot. And still, the ripples from that moment were expanding outward, transforming what might have been a private humiliation into a catalyst for public accountability. Back in the terminal, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a shocking, isolated incident had transformed into a moment of public reckoning. The air seemed charged with a kind of electric anticipation. The normal sounds of the airport announcements echoing through speakers, wheels rolling across polished floors. The constant hum of conversation seemed muted, as if the terminal itself were holding its breath. The morning sunlight streaming through the vast windows had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the gathered crowd. Dominique stood tall, phone still in hand after the call with Thomas Whitfield. Her posture was straight but not rigid, confident but not aggressive. The subtle rise and fall of her chest was the only visible sign of the emotional storm contained within a mixture of vindication, determination, and the familiar weariness that came from navigating these waters yet again. Around her, the crowd had grown larger and more diverse. Some were passengers from Flight 287, others were travelers from nearby gates drawn by the commotion. Airport staff hovered at the edges, uncertain how to respond to a situation that had escalated beyond normal protocols. Security personnel maintained a respectful distance, recognizing that the immediate crisis had passed but remaining vigilant. William Foster had returned from the aircraft and now stood beside Dominique, his academic demeanor complemented by a quiet authority that came from his Harvard position and board membership. "Thomas is on his way," he said quietly. "The board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon." Dominique nodded. "Good. Institutional change requires leadership engagement." William studied her with newfound respect. "You expected this outcome." It wasn't a question, but Dominique answered anyway. "I prepared for it. There's a difference. Around them." The crowd of onlookers had grown. Nicole's live stream had now reached over 100,000 viewers. Someone had recognized Dominique and identified her in the comments. The information was spreading rapidly. "She's Dominique Reynolds, CEO of Skyline Safety Systems, the woman who revolutionized aircraft black box technology. OMG. Summit just fired their flight attendant for disrespecting a literal aviation industry leader." Phones were being passed around showing Dominique's official corporate biography, her TED Talk on innovation, her Forbes cover feature from the previous year. The narrative was shifting from black woman humiliated to distinguished CEO subjected to discrimination, creating a new dimension of outrage and interest. Richard Kensington approached, notepad in hand. His judicial bearing commanded attention even in retirement, and the crowd parted unconsciously to let him through. "Ms. Reynolds, I've documented the entire incident. As a former federal judge, I'd be willing to provide a formal statement regarding what I witnessed here today." "Thank you, Your Honor," Dominique replied. Richard glanced around at the growing crowd, then lowered his voice. "I spent 30 years on the bench, witnessing all manner of human behavior. What I saw today, your composure in the face of blatant disrespect, was truly remarkable." Dominique's smile held a hint of weariness. "Practice makes perfect. Unfortunately," Richard nodded. understanding the weight behind those simple words. I've presided over numerous discrimination cases. The challenge has always been documentation proving intent, establishing patterns. What I witnessed here was unusually well documented. That was by design, Dominique replied. Protocol 3 is built on the understanding that accountability requires irrefutable evidence. Protocol 3, Richard inquired. His judicial curiosity piqued. A comprehensive system for documenting and addressing discriminatory incidents. Today was its first major public deployment. Understanding dawned in Richard's eyes. So this wasn't just about one incident. It never is. Dominique confirmed. Individual accountability matters, but without structural change, the same behaviors will continue with different actors. As they spoke, an elderly passenger approached Dominique. His weathered face and gentle demeanor suggested wisdom earned through decades of experience. "Ms. Reynolds," he said quietly, "I want to thank you. What happened here today? It reminded me of something I witnessed 50 years ago on a bus in Montgomery. I was too young, too afraid to speak up then. I've regretted it ever since." Dominique took his hand in both of hers. "It's never too late to be on the right side of history." The man nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. The world changes when good people refuse to be silent. His words carried a weight beyond their simple meaning, a bridge between past struggles and present challenges, a reminder that what was happening wasn't entirely new, just newly visible. Maria Gonzalez stepped forward as well. "I have everything on video, from the moment she kicked your suitcase. It's all time-stamped." She held up her phone, showing the footage she'd captured. "My brother is a civil rights attorney in Los Angeles. He always says documentation is the first step toward justice. Your brother is right." Dominique agreed. "Would you be willing to share that footage with our team? It could help establish multiple angles of the incident." "Of course," Maria replied, already sending the file to the email address on Dominique's business card. Alejandro returned from the gate desk, the Summit Airlines logo on his uniform badge catching the light. "Ms. Reynolds, Operations has instructed that Flight 287 will remain at the gate until this situation is resolved." The terminal clock now showed 9:45 a.m., exactly 12 minutes since the incident began. Passengers gathered near the windows to watch as a black SUV with Summit Airlines markings pulled up to the terminal. Thomas Whitfield, a distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, emerged and walked briskly toward the entrance. "He's here," William observed. Dominique took a deep breath, centering herself. This was the moment when Protocol 3 would face its ultimate test. It wasn't designed just to document and punish individual acts of discrimination. It was designed to create opportunities for structural change. Would Thomas Whitfield see this as merely a PR crisis to be managed, or as a moment for genuine transformation? His response would reveal Summit Airlines' true values far more clearly than any mission statement or diversity training program ever could. Victoria Palmer arrived first, slightly out of breath, her HR badge prominently displayed. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her tailored pantsuit suggested someone who valued both competence and comfort. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Victoria Palmer, HR Director for Summit. I cannot express how deeply sorry we are for what happened here today." Dominique shook her hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Victoria glanced around at the gathered crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. I think we're past the point of privacy." Dominique replied gently but firmly. What happened here wasn't private. The response shouldn't be either. Victoria nodded, accepting the logic. Of course. I want you to know that we had identified concerning patterns in Miss Pearson's behavior and had scheduled an intervention. Unfortunately, we didn't act quickly enough to prevent today's incident. Systems often prioritize procedure over protection, Dominique observed. That's part of what needs to change. The crowd parted as Thomas Whitfield arrived, flanked by two executives. He moved directly to Dominique, ignoring everyone else. His expression was grave but determined, his handshake firm. "Dominique, I'm so sorry," he said, genuine regret in his voice. "This is not who we are as a company." "Isn't it?" Dominique asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, challenging and profound. Thomas had no immediate response, recognizing the truth embedded in the question. No matter what values Summit Airlines proclaimed, what had happened today had occurred within their culture, enacted by their employee, enabled by their systems. "You're right to question that," he finally acknowledged. "What happened today suggests a gap between our stated values and our lived practices. I can only say that I'm committed to closing that gap." The terminal clock showed 9:48 a.m., exactly 16 minutes after the incident, but more importantly, exactly 3 minutes after Thomas Whitfield had received the call that would change everything. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Thomas suggested, glancing at the crowd. "No," Dominique replied firmly. "Discrimination happens in public. Accountability should too." Thomas nodded, understanding the importance of the moment. "Then let me say publicly what needs to be said. What happened to you today was inexcusable. Ms. Pearson has been terminated, effective immediately. But I recognize that removing one employee doesn't solve the underlying issues." He turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the terminal. "To everyone who witnessed this incident, I want you to know that Summit Airlines is committed to doing better. Not just with words, but with actions. Starting today," turning back to Dominique, he continued, "Ms. Reynolds, I believe we have a contract to discuss. But perhaps more importantly, we have an opportunity to transform not just Summit Airlines, but potentially the entire industry's approach to these issues." Dominique studied him carefully, weighing his sincerity. "I'm listening. The technology partnership outlined in our contract is groundbreaking for aviation safety," Thomas said. "But what if we expanded its scope? What if we applied the same rigor, the same innovative thinking, to creating a comprehensive approach to eliminating bias and discrimination in customer service?" A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the corporate damage control they had expected. "That's an ambitious proposal," Dominique replied. "No more ambitious than what you've already accomplished with Protocol 3, Thomas said. Dominique's eyes widened slightly. "You know about Protocol 3, Thomas smiled. "I make it my business to know what my partners are developing. The question is, are you willing to partner with Summit to implement it across our entire organization, not just as a response to this incident, but as a commitment to fundamental change for the first time since the confrontation began?" Dominique smiled. "Mr. Whitfield, I believe this is the beginning of a very productive conversation." William Foster checked his watch. "The flight is now 35 minutes delayed. What would you like to do about that?" Thomas looked at Dominique. "That's entirely up to Ms. Reynolds. It's her flight. After all, the flight should proceed," Dominique decided. "The passengers shouldn't be further inconvenienced because of this incident." "And will you be on it?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Dominique replied. "I have a contract to review during the flight." As they prepared to return to the aircraft, Nicole Bennett approached cautiously, her live stream still active. Ms. Reynolds, my live stream has over 200,000 viewers now. People are asking if you'd like to say something. Dominique thought for a moment, then nodded. Speaking directly to the camera, she said, "Today, many of you witnessed what happens all too often to people who look like me, though rarely so publicly. What you're seeing now is also rare immediate accountability and a commitment to real change. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Keep watching." "Would you do anything differently if you faced discrimination like this?" Nicole asked her viewers. Share your thoughts in the comments. How do we all become better allies in these moments? With that, Nicole ended her live stream, but the conversation she had started would continue long after Flight 287 had departed, as Dominique Reynolds, Thomas Whitfield, and their impromptu entourage walked back toward the aircraft. The atmosphere in the terminal had completely transformed. What had begun as a routine Monday morning had become something historic, a moment when the invisible power dynamics that governed everyday interactions had been exposed and challenged. Passengers lined the jetway, many with phones still recording. Some applauded softly as Dominique passed. Others simply nodded in respect. The hushed conversations created a backdrop of white noise, punctuated occasionally by gasps of recognition as people realized who she was. That's Dominique Reynolds, the Skyline CEO. She's the one who developed the emergency landing system that saved that flight over Denver last year. I had no idea she was so young. The lighting in the jetway cast dramatic shadows on the walls as they walked, creating a cinematic quality to their procession. The air was noticeably cooler than in the terminal, raising goosebumps on exposed skin. The distant sound of the aircraft's idling engines created a low, constant hum that seemed to underscore the significance of the moment. Sofia Ramirez stood at the aircraft door, her posture straight but her eyes revealing her anxiety. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her to hide their slight trembling. When she saw Dominique approaching with Thomas Whitfield himself, her composure nearly cracked. "Ms. Reynolds, Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "Welcome aboard Flight 287. Thomas smiled warmly. "Sophia, thank you for stepping up today. I understand you've been handling a difficult situation with remarkable professionalism." Sophia blushed slightly, the color rising from her neck to her cheeks. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "That's exactly the point," Thomas replied, meeting her eyes directly. "When everyone is simply doing their job with integrity, incidents like what happened earlier don't occur." The subtle validation in his words wasn't lost on Sophia. Her shoulders straightened imperceptibly, and her next breath came easier. As they boarded the aircraft, a hush fell over the cabin. Every eye turned to watch Dominique return to her seat in 2A, followed by the CEO of Summit Airlines. The symbolism was lost on no one, least of all the passengers in first class who had witnessed the initial confrontation. The cabin felt different now, charged with anticipation and significance. The usual pre-departure sounds, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of magazines, the soft ping of call buttons were muted, as everyone focused on the unfolding drama at the front of the plane. Thomas stepped to the front of the cabin and took the announcement microphone. His voice came clearly through the speakers throughout the aircraft, carrying to every passenger regardless of cabin class. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Thomas Whitfield, CEO of Summit Airlines. I want to apologize for the delay in our departure and for the unfortunate incident many of you witnessed earlier. Summit Airlines is committed to providing a respectful, dignified experience for every passenger, regardless of their appearance, background, or the cabin they're seated in." He paused, looking directly at Dominique. "Today, we failed to uphold that commitment. For that, I am deeply sorry. The employee responsible is no longer with Summit Airlines, effective immediately. A murmur ran through the cabin, confirmation of what many had suspected but still shocking to hear announced so publicly. Several passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, recognizing the rarity of such a direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing from a corporate leader. Miss Ramirez will be serving as your chief flight attendant for this flight. Thomas continued, gesturing toward Sophia, who stood nearby. She has my complete confidence, and I trust she'll demonstrate the true standard of Summit service that each of you deserves. He handed the microphone back to Sophia, then turned to Dominique. Ms. Reynolds, is there anything you'd like to add? Dominique considered for a moment, then shook her head. Your actions speak clearly enough, Mr. Whitfield. No additional words are necessary. Thomas nodded respectfully, then addressed the cabin once more. We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for choosing Summit Airlines. As Thomas made his way back through the jetway, William Foster caught his arm. Thomas, the board meeting, I know. Thomas interrupted. I'll be there, but right now, I'm more concerned with making sure Ms. Reynolds has the flight experience she deserves. The board can wait. William smiled slightly. For what it's worth, I think you're handling this exactly right. We'll see, Thomas replied, his expression thoughtful. The real work begins after the cameras stop rolling. Back in the cabin, Sophia was efficiently directing the pre-departure service, her earlier nervousness replaced by focused determination. Jessica and David moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, aware that their service was now under particular scrutiny. As Sophia passed Dominique's seat, she quietly asked, Is there anything special I can get for you, Miss Reynolds? Dominique looked up from her laptop where she had already begun reviewing the $500 million contract that had nearly been scattered across the terminal floor. Just some water, please. And Sophia, you're doing an excellent job. Sophia's smile was genuine. Thank you. That means a lot. The genuine warmth in the exchange was noticed by nearby passengers. Several nodded approvingly, recognizing the professionalism of both women in the aftermath of a difficult situation. Across the aisle, Richard Kensington was observing the interaction with approval. It's refreshing to see leadership that recognizes talent regardless of seniority, he commented. It's one of the fundamental principles at Skyline. Dominique replied, We promote based on capability, not time served. Richard raised an eyebrow. An unusual approach in traditional industries. Perhaps that's why traditional industries struggle with innovation, Dominique suggested. The same hierarchies that preserve status quo also stifle new ideas. In row 3, Maria Gonzalez was explaining what had happened to an elderly couple who had missed the initial confrontation. And then the CEO himself came and fired her on the spot. She concluded, her hands gesturing expressively. Good, the elderly woman said firmly, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades. In my day, we had to tolerate that kind of treatment. It's about time things changed. Her husband nodded in agreement. Never understood why some folks get so worked up about who sits where on an airplane. We're all going to the same place, just with different-sized seats. The simple wisdom in his observation elicited chuckles from those within earshot. Even Dominique smiled, appreciating the man's perspective. Nicole Bennett, now seated in row 4, was updating her followers, her voice hushed but excited. We're back on the plane now. The Summit CEO just announced that the flight attendant has been fired. Ms. Reynolds is in her seat, cool as can be. like she handles corporate drama before breakfast every day, which, come to think of it, she probably does. Comments continued to flood her live stream. This is the best reality show I've seen in years. Corporate accountability in real time. Who else is Googling Dominique Reynolds right now? I need to know more about this protocol. 3 thing, she mentioned. Am I the only one who thinks firing someone without an investigation is a bit much? What happened to due process? Due process doesn't apply when you kick someone's luggage across a terminal floor in front of 100 witnesses. As the cabin door closed and the aircraft prepared to push back from the gate, Dominique allowed herself a moment of reflection. The familiar sensations of pre-departure, the slight adjustment in cabin pressure, the final checks by flight attendants, the gradual quieting of conversation provided a backdrop for her thoughts. Protocol 3 had worked exactly as designed, documenting the incident, facilitating immediate accountability, and creating an opening for structural change. But the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Would Summit Airlines follow through on Thomas Whitfield's promises? Or would this become just another corporate apology forgotten as soon as the public spotlight moved elsewhere? Her phone buzzed with a text from Jackson just before she switched to airplane mode. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox all running the story. Hatch Summit accountability trending nationwide. Protocol 3 documentation being called a new standard for corporate accountability by the Washington Post. You've started something big, sis. Dominique smiled slightly as she put her phone in airplane mode. We've started something, she whispered to herself, but we're far from finished. The aircraft began to push back from the gate, its powerful engines rumbling to life. Flight 287 was finally departing 55 minutes behind schedule, but carrying a story that was just beginning to unfold. In the terminal, Thomas Whitfield watched the aircraft begin its taxi, his expression thoughtful. Victoria Palmer stood beside him, tablet in hand. I've drafted a company-wide communication about the incident, she said. Would you like to review it before distribution? Thomas shook his head. No need. Just make sure it's honest. No corporate spin. No euphemisms. We're going to address this directly. And the board meeting, I'll be there in an hour. In the meantime, I need you to pull every discrimination complaint we've received in the past year. Every single one. Regardless of resolution status. Victoria nodded, making a note on her tablet. And what about Protocol 3? Are we really considering implementing it across the entire airline? Thomas turned to face her fully. We're not just considering it. We're doing it. Today's incident wasn't an aberration. Victoria. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, one we've allowed to persist for too long. Implementation will be expensive, she noted. And complex. So is discrimination, Thomas replied. Thomas. The difference is that Protocol 3 has a solution at the end. Now let's get to work. We have a lot to do before that plane lands in San Francisco. As they walked back toward their waiting car, the morning sun illuminated the terminal building, its glass facade reflecting the blue sky and passing clouds. Inside, thousands of travelers continued their journeys, unaware that the rules governing their experience had just begun to change. Flight 287 soared into that same sky, carrying with it not just passengers and cargo, but a story that would transform an industry. And in Seat 2A, Dominique Reynolds reviewed her contract, made notes for implementation, and prepared for the next phase of a journey that had begun long before she'd ever set foot in JFK that morning. 3 months after the incident, Summit Airlines unveiled its transformed approach to customer service. The Dignity in Flight initiative wasn't just a rebranding exercise. It represented a fundamental shift in how the airline viewed its passengers and staff. The launch event took place in Summit's newly renovated main terminal at JFK, the very location where the incident had occurred. The space had been physically transformed, with new design elements emphasizing inclusion and accessibility. Natural light poured through expanded windows, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Digital displays featured diverse travelers and staff interacting respectfully. Even the seating had been redesigned to accommodate a wider range of body types and accessibility needs. The $500 million contract with Skyline had expanded to include not just safety technology, but cultural transformation tools. The new systems monitored everything from complaint patterns to language used in customer interactions, identifying potential bias before it escalated to incidents. We're applying the same rigor to human safety that we've always applied to mechanical safety, Thomas explained to the assembled press and industry representatives. Both are equally critical to our mission. Thomas Whitfield had made the unprecedented move of publishing quarterly bias incident reports, complete with actions taken and lessons learned. The first report had been released that morning, drawing both praise and scrutiny from industry observers. Transparency isn't comfortable, he acknowledged in his keynote speech, standing beneath a banner that read, "Dignity in Flight, a New Journey Together." But comfort isn't how we grow. The keynote was part of the first Transportation Equity Conference, co-sponsored by Summit Airlines and Skyline Safety Systems. Industry leaders from airlines, railways, and rideshare companies gathered to learn from Summit's transformation. The conference center buzzed with energy as competitors became collaborators in addressing a shared challenge. Dominique Reynolds took the stage to thunderous applause, the audience rising to their feet in recognition of her catalytic role. 3 months ago, I was just another passenger being told I didn't belong, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. Today, I'm part of an industry-wide movement to ensure that never happens to anyone else. The changes weren't just procedural. They were measurable. Summit's customer satisfaction scores had increased by 22%. Employee retention had improved. Even their stock price had recovered and surpassed pre-incident levels. But the most profound changes were the personal ones. Sofia Ramirez had been promoted to Director of Cabin Experience, the youngest person ever to hold the position. Under her leadership, Summit had introduced new uniform options, relaxed grooming policies, and emphasized personal connection over rigid protocol. We're shifting our focus from appearances to interactions, Sophia explained in a company-wide communication, her confidence having grown remarkably in 3 short months. What matters isn't how a passenger looks or what they're wearing. What matters is treating each person with dignity and respect. The program she had developed with her team had become a model not just for Summit, but for the entire industry. Airlines across the globe were reaching out for guidance on implementing similar approaches. Nicole Bennett had launched a successful platform documenting acts of bias and accountability across various industries. Her approach wasn't about public shaming, but about highlighting when systems worked as they should. It's easy to focus on what goes wrong, she explained in an interview, seated in her newly established studio space. But I'm more interested in what goes right, in the moments when accountability functions as it should, when dignity prevails over discrimination. Her platform, Accountability, now had quickly gained over 1 million subscribers and had been featured in major publications as a positive example of how social media could drive constructive change. William Foster had expanded his case study into a book, The Economics of Equity, How Inclusive Practices Drive Bottom-Line Growth. The book detailed how Summit Airlines' response to the incident had not only repaired potential brand damage, but had actually enhanced their market position and financial performance. What this case demonstrates, William wrote in the conclusion, is that addressing bias isn't just morally right. It's financially smart. Companies that invest in comprehensive accountability structures see improvements in customer satisfaction, employee retention, and, ultimately, shareholder value. The book had quickly become required reading in business schools across the country, shifting the conversation from diversity as compliance to inclusion as competitive advantage. And surprisingly, Meredith Pearson had begun speaking publicly about her experience, not as a victim, but as someone confronting her own biases. Her talks in corporate settings were uncomfortable but powerful. Titled simply, "I Was Wrong: A Journey from Bias to Understanding, I spent years believing I was upholding standards," she would tell audiences, her humility evident in both her words and demeanor. "I never questioned where those standards came from or who they were designed to include or exclude. That unquestioning acceptance made me a perfect vehicle for perpetuating bias, all while believing I was just doing my job." Her perspective was particularly valuable for managers struggling to understand how apparently professional employees could engage in discriminatory behavior. By describing her own thought processes candidly, Meredith helped illuminate the often unconscious biases that shaped seemingly neutral decisions. The journey hadn't been easy for her. After losing her job, she had faced financial hardship and public humiliation, but through counseling and honest self-reflection, she had begun to transform her understanding of herself and others. While she would never return to Summit Airlines, she had found a new purpose in helping others recognize and address their own biases before they manifested in harmful behavior. One of Summit's most powerful marketing campaigns featured side-by-side images the moment Dominique's suitcase was kicked, and a recent photo of Dominique boarding a Summit flight, greeted respectfully by a diverse cabin crew. The tagline was simple: "We learned, we changed. Will you join us?" The campaign had resonated widely, particularly among minority travelers who had experienced similar treatment. Summit's market share among these demographics had increased significantly, demonstrating that addressing bias wasn't just ethically right, it was good business. At Skyline, the protocol 3 division had grown exponentially. What had begun as a small team developing an experimental system had become a major business unit, providing bias accountability infrastructure to companies across multiple industries. Jackson Reynolds now oversaw a staff of over 100, with implementations in progress at 27 major corporations. The demand was so great that they had established a wait list, prioritizing industries with direct customer impact like healthcare, hospitality, and retail. "What we're seeing," Jackson explained to Dominique during a strategy meeting in their expanded New York offices, "is that companies are moving beyond viewing bias as a PR risk. They're beginning to understand it as a structural issue that affects every aspect of their operations." Dominique nodded, reviewing the implementation data on her tablet. "That's the shift we've been working toward. Not treating symptoms, but addressing root causes." The incident that had thrust them into the spotlight had accelerated their timeline dramatically, but the underlying work had been ready. Years of careful development, testing, and refinement had created a system that was ready to scale when the moment demanded it. As the 3-month mark approached, Dominique received an unexpected communication, a handwritten letter from Meredith Pearson. "Ms. Reynolds," it began, the careful penmanship suggesting considerable effort. "I've tried many times to write this letter, and each attempt feels inadequate. How do you apologize for something that was never just about one moment, but about a lifetime of unexamined assumptions?" The letter continued, detailing Meredith's journey since that day at JFK, the public humiliation, certainly, but more importantly, the painful self-examination it had prompted. "The hardest part wasn't losing my job," she wrote. "It was recognizing the person I had allowed myself to become. Someone so invested in hierarchy and exclusion that I was willing to literally kick another human being's belongings to assert my perceived authority." Meredith explained that she had been working with a therapist to understand the origins of her biases and with a diversity consultant to address them. I don't expect forgiveness," she concluded. "But I wanted you to know that what happened that day changed more than my employment status. It changed my understanding of the world and my place in it. For that painful but necessary education, I am genuinely grateful." Dominique read the letter several times before composing her response. "Ms. Pearson, thank you for your letter. The journey you describe, from unexamined bias to conscious understanding, is exactly the transformation Protocol 3 was designed to facilitate. Not punishment, but growth. Not shame, but awareness. Your willingness to engage in that difficult process speaks to your character. I believe that none of us are defined solely by our worst moments. What matters is how we respond to them, whether we become defensive and entrenched, or open and transformed. You've chosen the latter path, which is the harder but ultimately more rewarding one. I would welcome the opportunity to meet with you in person when our schedules allow. There is important work to be done in addressing bias at structural levels, and your perspective would be valuable in that effort. With respect, Dominique Reynolds. The exchange represented everything Protocol 3 was designed to achieve, not just addressing individual incidents, but creating pathways for genuine transformation, both personal and institutional. As the 3-month milestone approached, Skyline and Summit prepared a joint report detailing the impact of their partnership. The statistics were impressive: complaints about discriminatory treatment down by 78%, customer satisfaction up by 26%, employee engagement scores at an all-time high. But the qualitative changes were even more significant. Staff reported feeling empowered to address problematic behaviors rather than looking the other way. Passengers from diverse backgrounds described feeling truly welcomed for the first time. The culture was shifting in measurable, meaningful ways. One particularly telling statistic reports of bias incidents had actually increased by 42%. This wasn't because more incidents were occurring, but because people felt safe reporting them, confident that they would be addressed rather than dismissed. "That's how we know it's working," Dominique explained during a press conference, standing confidently before the assembled journalists. "True accountability creates safety. Safety to speak up. Safety to acknowledge errors. Safety to grow." Thomas Whitfield, standing beside her, nodded. 3 months ago, we experienced a painful but necessary wake-up call. Today, we're building something that goes far beyond that one incident. A model for how companies can address bias not through performative statements, but through rigorous, consistent accountability. As the press conference concluded, a reporter asked one final question. "Ms. Reynolds, you were already successful before this incident thrust you into the spotlight. Why put yourself through this? Why not just accept the apology and move on?" Dominique considered for a moment before responding. "Because moving on isn't enough," she said finally. "Not when the same patterns keep recurring for countless others who don't have the platform or power that I do. Protocol 3 was never about one incident or one individual. It was about creating structures that make accountability the rule rather than the exception." She gestured toward the assembled group of Summit Airlines executives and staff. "What you're seeing here isn't just one company's response to one incident. It's a blueprint for transformation that can be replicated across industries. That's worth far more than just moving on." 1 year to the day after the incident, Dominique Reynolds stood in the same JFK terminal where her suitcase had been kicked. The space had been transformed, not just physically with new design elements emphasizing inclusion, but energetically. The staff moved differently. They saw differently. The morning light streamed through the expanded windows, casting a warm glow across the polished floors. The ambient sounds of the terminal conversations, announcements, rolling luggage created a familiar soundtrack. but the atmosphere felt fundamentally different, more open, more welcoming, more humane. Dominique carried the same leather suitcase, now bearing a small, barely noticeable scuff mark that she had chosen not to repair. A reminder, not of humiliation, but of transformation. Thomas Whitfield met her at the gate. 1 year, he said, offering his hand. I never would have believed how far we'd come. I would. Dominique replied simply. They walked together toward the Summit Airlines Premium Lounge, now renamed the Skyline Lounge as part of their expanded partnership. Inside, they found an unexpected gathering. Sophia, now Summit's Vice President of Customer Experience, William Foster, Richard Kensington, Maria Gonzalez, Nicole Bennett, Jackson Reynolds, Victoria Palmer, and dozens of others who had been part of the transformation journey. Surprise, Thomas said with a smile. We couldn't let this anniversary pass without marking it properly. The lounge had been decorated subtly but meaningfully. Photos documented the year's milestones: the first Protocol 3 training session, the Transportation Equity Conference, Sophia's promotion, the launch of the Dignity in Flight initiative. Each image told part of a story that had begun with conflict but evolved into collaboration. A plaque on the wall caught Dominique's eye. It read, "The Reynolds Principle. Dignity is not determined by destination, class, or appearance, but by our common humanity. Established, April 2024. Richard Kensington raised a glass. To turning points, he said, his judicial gravitas now warmed by friendship. To speaking up, added Sophia, who had grown from a hesitant junior flight attendant to a confident executive. To accountability, said William, whose case study had evolved into a movement within business education. Thomas turned to Dominique. Would you like to say a few words? Dominique looked around at the faces gathered, not just executives and celebrities, but gate agents, baggage handlers, flight attendants, and passengers who had been invited to share the moment. The morning light through the lounge windows illuminated them all equally, regardless of rank or role. A year ago, I stood in this terminal and was told I didn't belong. She began. That moment could have been just another indignity to endure, another story to tell my friends about flying while black. She touched the scuff mark on her suitcase. Instead, it became the catalyst for something far more powerful than retribution. It became a beginning rather than an end. The true measure of change isn't in new policies or programs, she continued, meeting the eyes of those gathered. It's in the experience of every passenger who boards a flight feeling seen and respected, regardless of how they look or what seat they occupy. She raised her glass. To dignity, not as a privilege for some, but as a right for all. As conversations flowed around her, Dominique stepped away briefly to observe the regular operations of the terminal. She watched as a young black girl approached the first-class check-in counter. Tennis shoes scuffed, jeans simple, traveling alone. The agent smiled warmly, making eye contact with the child. Good afternoon. How can I help you today? No assumptions, no judgment, just respect. The girl presented her ticket and was welcomed efficiently and warmly. Dominique smiled. This moment of ordinary dignity was the real victory. She rejoined the gathering, where Thomas was sharing Summit's latest results. Our customer satisfaction is at an all-time high, he was saying, pride evident in his voice. But more importantly, our complaint rate for discriminatory treatment is down 96%. And the remaining 4% Dominique asked, addressed within 24 hours, with full transparency. Thomas replied without hesitation. The protocol in action. As the event concluded, Dominique prepared to board her flight. This time, no one questioned her presence in first class. No one doubted she belonged. As she settled into seat 2A, she noticed her seatmate, a young woman of color, dressed casually, looking slightly nervous. First time in first class, Dominique asked gently. The woman nodded. "Yes, I saved up for this. Always wanted to try it." "Welcome," Dominique said with a warm smile. "You belong here." And in that simple exchange, one passenger affirming another's right to dignity, the true power of the past year's transformation was made clear, not in corporate policies or public statements, but in the everyday human connections that define our shared journey. Because in the end, dignity isn't something that can be assigned by seat number or uniform. It rises, like an aircraft breaking through clouds, when we recognize the humanity in one another. That recognition, that simple, profound shift in seeing, can happen in just 3 minutes, but its effects can transform an industry, and more importantly, the lives of everyone it touches. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational content that makes a difference. Share this video with friends and family who need to hear this message of accountability, dignity, and transformation. And drop a comment below sharing your own experiences. Have you ever stood up against discrimination or been a witness when someone else did? Remember, change starts with each of us, one brave moment at a time.